It's 1967, and the Vietnam War is burning hot enough to turn maps into myths. Northwest of Saigon, near the Cambodian border, the jungle doesn't just grow, it hides. It folds over trails, swallows footsteps, muffles engines, and keeps secrets in its damp, rotting breath. In that green maze, a small American outpost waits to be attacked, and that's the point. It was built to look weak, built to look isolated, built to invite an assault. The enemy accepted the invitation. This is Fire Base Thunder, and the men who held it when the night came down. In the late years of America's long war, Tay Ninh Province never truly went quiet. Even at noon, the canopy broke sunlight into thin, watery shafts. Sound traveled strangely. One minute you could hear a bird like it was in your ear, the next minute a whole firefight could happen a few hundred meters away and vanish into leaves and mist. The border sat nearby like a cruel joke. On paper, it was a line. In reality, it was a doorway the enemy could walk through and disappear. Rest, resupply, reorganize, then slip back out when it suited them. American units weren't supposed to follow in force. The jungle on the far side might as well have been a locked room. Commanders knew the enemy lived there, moved there, planned there, but they could never quite hold him still long enough to finish the fight. By mid-1967, frustration hardened into doctrine. Stop chasing shadows, build a target, make him come to you. The concept was simple, almost arrogant in its simplicity, a trap made of sandbags and confidence. They would build a small base, make it appear lonely and underfed, and let the enemy believe he'd found a weakness. And when he came, they would destroy him with firepower so precise it would feel like fate. They named it Fire Base Thunder. The engineers arrived first, and the jungle fought them every meter. Bulldozers growled through undergrowth, pushing aside vines thick as wrists, knocking down hardwood giants that had stood longer than any country at war. Trees fell with slow, reluctant cracks, as if the forest itself were taking notes. The clearing opened like a wound. Berms went up, high, ugly walls of packed earth. Fighting pits were dug until hands blistered and shoulders burned. Sandbags were filled until the men stopped feeling their fingers and started feeling only the rhythm. Scoop, lift, stack, repeat. Concertina wire rolled out in overlapping coils, silver in the sun, black in the rain. Antennas rose from the dust like thin metal prayers. The firebase was small enough to walk across in a minute, but every corner of it mattered. Every plank, every shovel of dirt, every coil of wire was a sentence in the same message. Come closer. Thunder sat in contested country, close enough to the border that enemy units could vanish across it like smoke. That limitation was exactly why Thunder existed. The fire base wasn't meant to conquer the jungle. It was meant to deny it comfort, to turn enemy movement into risk, to turn sanctuary into a place that could be punished. Fewer than 200 men lived there once the work was done. Not a fortress, not a town, just a tight island of steel and sandbags surrounded by an ocean of green. Bravo Company took responsibility for the perimeter. Infantry not large enough to sweep a province, but experienced enough to hold a line when the line was all that stood between breathing and not breathing. Battery C set up the guns. Heavy howitzers dug into their pits like blunt instruments waiting for permission. And around them, medics, radio operators, mechanics, cooks, men who carried wrenches and bandages and ladles, but who still slept with rifles within arm's reach because the jungle did not care what your job title was. The base became a machine built for one purpose: to answer an attack without thinking. Distances were measured and remeasured. Sectors were assigned. Likely avenues of approach were mapped. Coordinates were written on laminated cards and stuffed into pockets. Mortar positions were plotted. Claymore mines were placed in overlapping arcs, silent teeth pointing outward. Outside the wire, a fallen log here, a rise of earth there, a patch of brush left deliberately, natural shelter, at least from a distance. In reality, they sat squarely inside pre-registered impact zones. Weeks before the first shot, Thunder was already aiming. The enemy watched the whole thing. From the jungle, eyes followed every bulldozer pass, every sandbag stack, every gun pit dug deeper. They counted the howitzers. They measured the perimeter. They studied the rhythm of the guards, the flare patterns, the way the Americans shifted at dusk. They decided the fire base could be taken, and they decided it would be taken at night, when fear is loudest and silhouettes become targets. On a warm evening just after 10 p.m., the first rounds landed. A rocket slammed into a bunker on the southern wall, bursting sandbags like paper sacks and sending fragments snapping into the dark. Another rocket hit near the artillery pits, shaking the ground hard enough to make teeth click. Then the mortars began, steady, walking across the interior of the base like someone dragging a rake through dirt. They searched for gun crews. They searched for defenders. They searched for panic. It was textbook. Thunder answered textbook in return. Men sprinted to their howitzers as if pulled by strings. Gunners threw shells onto trays. Loaders rammed them home. Fire direction shouted grids that were already written, already rehearsed, already memorized in the muscles of exhausted teenagers. No time wasted on calculations. The math had been done weeks earlier. Out in the trees, assault waves were forming. Hundreds of men moving in disciplined silence, officers pulling them forward like a tide pulling the sea. A whistle blew. Shouts cut through the jungle, and the first company surged out of cover, running into open ground they believed would carry them quickly to the wire. It was the last decision many of them ever made. Airburst shells detonated above their heads. The night filled filled with invisible storms, steel fragments raining downward, slicing leaves, ripping flesh, shredding formations. The clearing that had looked like weakness suddenly became a killing field, measured to the meter. Still, the assault didn't vanish. North Vietnamese discipline was hard, hammered by years of war. Officers pushed survivors forward. Fresh waves emerged from the trees, stepping over the fallen, forcing themselves into the fire as if momentum alone could carry them through. Inside Thunder, machine guns opened from bunkers, stitching the darkness with bright lines. Riflemen fired until barrels smoked. Medics crawled through dust and shock, hands busy in the dim red light of bunker lamps, turning bandages into miracles that lasted long enough to matter. Some of the attackers reached the inner perimeter. Sappers, men trained to move like ghosts, got close enough to place charges. A section of wire erupted, a sudden gap where there had been teeth. For a heartbeat, it looked like the enemy had found the seam. Then the gap became a funnel. American gunners raked it with overlapping fire until the opening filled with bodies and sparks and torn wire. Claymores popped in flat, violent bursts. Flares rose and turned the clearing into harsh daylight, exposing men mid-run, faces caught in surprise, as if they'd been yanked into the open by a giant hand. The assault broke before dawn, not because the enemy ran out of courage, but because he ran out of men who could still stand. When the sky finally lightened, Thunder was still there. Smoke drifted over shattered trees. The air smelled of burned powder, wet soil, and something coppery you didn't want to name. Beyond the wire, the cleared ground was littered with dark shapes that hadn't moved since the last flare burned out. Inside the base, the men didn't cheer. They sat in their fighting pits, exhausted, ears ringing, hands shaking now that adrenaline had nothing left to hold on to. Some stared at the jungle like they expected it to speak. Some laughed in short, strange bursts that sounded wrong in daylight. 2 nights later, the enemy tested again. Another probing blow, another attempt to find the weak spot. Thunder answered with artillery and fixed machine gun fire, repelling the attack the same way you slam a door shut on a storm. By the end of the week, the regimental force that had moved into the area had bled itself dry against Thunder's berms, mines, wire, and pre-registered death. The trap had worked, but traps don't stay clever forever. By 1969, fire-based Thunder was dismantled. The guns moved out first, dragged away like heavy regrets. Antennas came down, generators were shut off, sandbags were emptied or left to rot. Fighting pits softened under rain. The jungle began stitching itself back together. Patient as always, Thunder became just another scar in a country full of them. By 1970, American strategy shifted again. Large fixed fire bases became fewer. Mobility increased. Air cavalry raids, temporary landing zones, rapid insertions. Moving war replaced static defense in many regions. The jungle demanded motion. It punished anything that stayed still too long. Yet for a brief window in 1967, that small patch of Tay Ninh jungle was a place where 19-year-olds held ground because there was nowhere else to go. If you stood there now, you wouldn't see a berm to climb. You'd see uneven earth, thicker vegetation, maybe a piece of rusted metal half buried in the soil. You'd hear insects and wind and the distant complaint of birds. It would look like nothing special, but history doesn't measure places by how they look decades later. It measures them by what happened when the night came down, and a small island of sandbags and steel refused to sink. Because in the end, fire-based Thunder wasn't famous for being permanent. It was famous for being held, for a few violent nights when the jungle tried to swallow it whole and the men inside answered with discipline, fear, grit, and fire. And then, like so many things in that war, it disappeared back into the green, leaving only the story and the names that should never fade.